Hello and welcome to Chapter 4 of AP Economics, Structured Independent Study. Chapter 4 is our last foundational chapter, and in this chapter we take a look at how the United States has modified or customized Adam Smith's concepts of capitalism. In this look at our customized capitalist system, we're going to start with examining the importance of the right laws and policies to a capitalist system within a civil society. You will recall that Adam Smith said that under capitalism there should be limited government involvement in an economy. We're going to take a look at in this chapter when the government does get involved, and we're going to examine its involvement in the role of providing public goods, regulation, and welfare programs, which are also known as safety nets. We will also take a look at the government's involvement in promoting growth and stability for our society. And the last thing we'll do in this chapter is to take a look at how to manage and avoid negative externalities. So let's get started. As I mentioned a few moments ago, we're going to start this chapter by taking a look at laws and policies within our customized capitalist system. And we're going to take a look at laws and policies with an eye towards how they protect our economic freedoms. In considering how the government protects our economic freedoms through the rule of law, I would like for you to keep in mind three things. Here's the first. Protecting our personal liberties is critical to having Adam Smith's concept of the invisible hand working correctly and guiding our economy. It's critical, the protection of the personal liberties is critical to promoting the existence of incentive, competition, and profit. The second thing is that through the rule of law, we protect our property rights. And the right to own things is critical to being able to exchange what we own or our resources and therefore be able to create additional capital. And the third thing I'd like for you to remember is that it's through the rule of law that we create the enforcement systems that help us protect the personal liberties and the property rights. In our look at how the rule of law protects our economic freedoms, this is a good time to step back for a moment and make sure that everybody understands the difference between laws and policies. So let me start with a definition for law. And this brings in a little bit of our sociology aspect to our study. Laws are rules or norms established by an authority or a society to protect the public interest. Now, what we mean by public interest can take on a number of different dimensions, but since we're in the study of economics here, we're going to take a look at the economic perspective of this, or in other words, what is the economic public interest? And we define the economic public interest as the collective needs of the population or society that cannot be met by the marketplace, or as some people say, what is best for society. We're going to come back and touch upon the concept of economic public interest a little bit more as we proceed through this chapter and also as we proceed through the year in our study of economics. But let me now come back to the topic of laws and the laws that are designed to preserve our economic freedoms. Here's the first example of some laws designed to preserve economic freedoms. We have laws in place to protect property rights, and as I mentioned before, that's important to creating capital. However, we also have some options available to the government that restrict what our property rights are in the public's interest. And probably the best example of this are the eminent domain laws that are actually written into our Constitution of the United States. If you're not familiar with the term eminent domain, let me give you a little background on that. It's the right of a government to actually take private property for public use. And this is usually done with compensation for the owner. Now, the United States Constitution provides for this directly. So what could the government take private property for public use that's in the public's interest? Well, for example, if they were going to build a school or needed to build or expand a roadway, that they would declare somebody's property eminent domain, but then compensate the individual accordingly for their property. Some synonyms are seizure, confiscated. Here's the term eminent domain used in another sentence. The city declared the property to be under eminent domain so that the new road could be built. I'd like to stop at this point before I go on to reference some other laws designed to preserve our economic freedoms and mention that we have a number of videos both in the primary supplemental video category on our website and the secondary supplemental video category on our website that looks at these laws such as eminent domain and also our laws to protect property rights in general. I highly recommend, strongly recommend to students that they make sure that they view some of those videos, it'll be a good provide a depth of understanding of the particular topic. A second example of laws designed to preserve economic freedoms are the laws that we have at the state and national level to enforce contracts that are made between individuals or between businesses for the exchange of property. In our system, we also have laws to promote competition. These laws promoting competition do so by outlawing anti-competitive business behaviors. As you recall from Chapter 3, promoting competition is critical to the proper functioning of the capitalist system, because it's through competition that we get innovation, and we need innovation to grow as a society. Now, probably the most recognized set of laws to promote competition are the Sherman-Clayton Antitrust Acts. But many times these are misunderstood to be the anti-monopoly laws. The reality of the situation is that monopolies are perfectly legal as long as they do not engage in anti-competitive business practices. So these are clearly the most recognized anti-competitive business practices laws that promote competition. I'll talk more about why monopolies are actually legal in Chapter 8, and I think you'll find that an interesting topic. The next set of laws we want to look at are laws to ensure public health and safety. The best example of these sets of laws come under the Occupational Safety and Health Act, OSHA, and they were initially instituted to help improve the health and safety of most industrial workplaces. The next set of laws are the laws to protect consumers. They're called caveat emptor labeling laws. Caveat emptor is a Latin term. It means buyer beware labeling. And probably the two most recognizable laws to protect consumers in this category are the laws that require the warning labels on cigarettes and the more recent laws that require warning labels on cups in which hot beverages are served. Now, these last two sets of laws, to ensure public health and safety as well as to protect consumers, cost businesses money through this regulation in having to put these warning labels in place. So when we look at these laws, we're looking at them as examples of trade-offs where we're asking businesses to do certain things in these cases, some regulation, for some protection in the public's interest. Okay, we've got a pretty good feel for how laws fit into and help us with our economic system. Now we're going to move on to policies. A policy is a course of action, a guiding principle, or a procedure. And let me give you a convenient way to keep policies and laws separate from each other. With regard to a law, if you break a law and get caught, it's very likely that you will wind up paying a fine and possibly doing some jail time. A policy is different. If you break a policy, you probably will not have any kind of a fine to pay, and you will not be doing any jail time. There may be some other consequences for not following a policy. You might lose your job or some other thing happen, but the penalties are not as severe as breaking a law. Now, with regard to policies, there are a couple of considerations that I'd like to talk about. Here's the first. Every policy has two aspects to it. The first is the ends. And what we mean by the ends are what decision makers are trying or attempting to achieve. For example, after the 9/11 tragic events in 2001, there was a policy put in place by the federal government to strengthen or improve our national security. The other aspect to a policy are the means. And what we mean by this is the ways by which the desired ends, or what we're trying to achieve, are to be achieved. Continuing with the example of improving or upgrading our national security based upon the events of 9/11, the federal government in that effort created the Department of Homeland Security. Now here's the second consideration with regard to policies that I'd like for you to understand. 4 questions should always be asked about policies before they're put in place. The first question is, what are the ends or goals of the policy? They should be very clearly understood. Second, are the proposed means for achieving the ends enough? Will it get you to your goal? Third, do the means that you've chosen have any adverse side effects? If you're not familiar with the word adverse, it means contrary to one's interests or welfare, opposed, antagonistic, counter. Here it's used in another sentence. The decision had an adverse, you could even say negative effect to what was intended, which hurt growth. And the fourth question that should be asked, what are the costs of alternative means of pursuing the ends or the goals? And this harkens back to the lessons that we learned in Chapter 2 about opportunity costs. Here are 2 additional examples to help you strengthen your understanding of what a policy would look like. And I'll use government policies for these examples. The federal government may be faced with a decision as to how much of the nation's tax revenue it would like to spend on defense. Well, how much goes into it will show what the priority the federal government is giving to defense. How much money will go into it and in what manner? Will the majority of the money spent go towards the Navy, the Army, the Air Force? These are all policy decision issues. Here's another example. How much of a priority is education? Is the government going to spend on education? How much money will go into it? And again, in what manner? Are schools going to be built? Or is the focus going to be on buying resources for the schools that already exist? Or hiring more personnel for the schools that exist? Policy making is a real important, as a matter of fact, it's critical to the executive branch of the government because it determines how discretionary tax money, meaning money that is not dictated to be spent by a law in a certain way, how discretionary tax money gets spent. If you're not familiar with the word discretionary, it means left to judgment, optional or elective. You have choice in it. She used discretion in making the decision. The next thing we will want to do with regard to our short look at laws and policies is to look at the role of economic theories in the development of laws and policies. You'll recall from Chapter 1 that the study of economics is a social science, and in the social sciences, we use the scientific approach, or some people would say the scientific method, to test out and try to validate theories that we have about economics. Now, in looking at economic theories in the development of laws and policies, I want to start by making 2 points. And here's the first one. Economic theories are used in an attempt to explain or bring some order to events and observations. And the economic theories are usually developed in relation to statements or questions that people have or make. The second point is that an economic theory that's proven to be correct has great value to us in that it helps us to be able to predict in advance the consequences of various actions. Actions related to laws, actions related to economic policies, or decision-making in general. Now, I'm going to make a point here that I want you to listen to very, very closely, because this is one of the most important points made in our study of economics in helping you become a well-qualified citizen and be able to make good decisions and guide our society in the right way. As a citizen, to hold your peers and government accountable for the right laws and policies, you must understand 2 additional important points that I'm going to make right now about the types of theory statements that people will use and what you must do with them. So let's get started. Here's the first of the important points. You must be able to distinguish between the types of statements that will be used by people. And there are 2 types of statements that will be used. The first type is called a positive statement. This is a statement or statements that are concerning what is, was, or will be. And positive statements can be settled by an appeal to facts. The other type of statement that people will make is called a normative statement. These are statements regarding concerns as to what ought to be. And these statements are subjective. They're value judgments and cannot be settled merely by an appeal to facts. Now, at this point, before we go any further, I want to recommend that students go to the class website in the supplemental video section and watch a brief video that gets into a little more depth about these 2 types of statements, a positive versus a normative statement. Let's look at an example with regard to these 2 types of statements. I'm going to give you 2 statements, and I'd like for you to think about for a second which is the positive and which is the normative. Here's the first one. It is impossible to break up atoms. Here's the second statement. scientists ought not to break up atoms. Which is the positive, which is the normative? Obviously, the first one is the positive, because we know for a fact that atoms can be broken apart. Your key to the second statement being normative is the word ought. Now let's go to the second consideration with regard to how to handle statements. The second responsibility you have as a contributing citizen is to be able to turn a normative statement made by somebody into something useful for study. Now, I'm going to give you two examples. The first one I'm going to start off with is a little bit trite, but I think you get the point, and it helps us lead into the second. So here's the statement. It's true in theory, but not in practice. Turning it into a positive statement, or putting pressure on the normative statement for something useful for study, one should respond to it by saying, all right then, tell me about what does happen in practice. Okay, let's be a little more practical and use a real example. And when I say a real example, use a real economics example that we come across in our study. And it's on a topic that I'm going to show you that we'll get into great depth in Chapter 7. So here's a statement that has been made by many people over the years. It is my judgment that we ought to have rent control because controls are good. Now, this is a normative statement. You're cued by two things, the word ought, because it's a value judgment, and also you can tie it to good as, by definition, that involves value judgment as well. So how do you, as a responsible citizen, go about turning this around for some useful study? Well, a very simple response would be to ask why, and say, okay, why do you feel that way? As you'll find out in Chapter 7, rent controls are not good. They statistically proven fact that it shows that they create more damage than they at all help anybody. But more for that later on. We're now finished for the time being with our brief look at laws and policies. And we're going to move on to the concept that Adam Smith talked about in explaining capitalism of limited government involvement in the capitalist economic system. And we're going to look at when it does make sense to have the government involved and to what extent. Now, we know the government is involved in the capitalist economic system through the enforcement of the rule of law, and that's how our economic freedoms are protected. But Adam Smith said that there was only one additional rational reason for government involvement beyond the rule of law. And Adam Smith said that the capitalist system is not completely self-sufficient, and there are some needs that cannot be met for the society through the free market or the open market. And in these cases, Adam Smith felt that the government can help us be a little more efficient and satisfy the needs of society. So the question then becomes, well, what needs could these be? So here are some examples of the needs of a society that cannot be met by the free market. And I'll use the United States as an example. Transportation systems. Our country has a massive complex of transportation systems when you consider everything from roads to mass transit systems and the like. There is no one person, not any of the richest people in the United States, that has enough wealth to pay for the support and maintenance and creating of our transportation systems. Not the Bill Gates of the world, the Oprah Winfreys, or whoever you would like to suggest, does not have enough wealth to carry that for us. The government is involved in providing our transportation systems, and we do it collectively through the government, through our taxes, and that's how these are provided. Now, the same holds true for national defense. There is no one person in the United States, nor probably strategically would we want to place our defense needs in the hands of one or two individuals either, from a security standpoint. But from a pure cost standpoint, or paying for it, no one individual can foot the cost of our national defense. The United States economy is a $15 trillion economy, and these are huge expense needs for the country. We get these satisfied through taxes and through the government. Some additional examples: education, public safety. Think of all the fire, first responder, and police functions that we have in our society to enforce the rule of law. Again, no one individual could carry the cost. One or two individuals could carry the cost for that. And even some important scientific work falls into this category. Adam Smith said, a little government intervention can help us be more efficient and productive, and these are good examples of what it makes sense. So then that begs the question, well, what would Adam Smith say wouldn't make sense, or would he not support? And I'll throw out a couple of examples for you right now. Some regulation that's done by the government over businesses in our society and in our economic system he would not support. Welfare programs he would not support. And I'm going to give you two others that we're going to get into more in depth in the next couple of chapters. Earmarks in this chapter, actually, and also subsidies. And we'll define what those are as we go down the road here. So the government is involved in our capitalist economic system, and in fact it's deeply involved. And it's this deep involvement that leads to a lot of controversy in our society and raises the question quite often as to what should government involvement depend upon. And it really boils down to two things. And here's the first. It should be dependent on what our needs are as a society, what our values are, what our priorities, and what our economic goals are. The second thing, and just as importantly, is that the involvement should depend on the tests of equity and efficiency. Let me tell you a little bit more about that. Let me start with equity. The involvement should be subject to the test of equity, meaning will it be equitable? Will the involvement treat everyone fairly or reasonably? From an efficiency standpoint, the question or the test should be, will the involvement be efficient and cost-effective? And this harkens back again to our opportunity cost considerations. And follow along here, and I think you'll see the point. Will the involvement produce an outcome that will either correct the problem or provide a benefit at a lower cost than if the government didn't get involved? And at the same time, not with its involvement, not upset equity, meaning treat somebody unfairly or unreasonably. Now let me give you a very simple example. Let's say the government, either a local, state, or federal government, decides that a building of a bridge is appropriate. And the only way the government can build a bridge is by using taxpayers' taxes that they pay to the government to fund the building and establishment of the bridge. So the cost is borne by the society or the taxpayers. What the bridge should be able to do is to promote enough commerce and extra business so the society can grow, And as a result of the growth, that the government would be able to bring in additional tax revenue from sales and income taxes to fuel further economic expansion and allow for possible social benefits. So in this simple case, the bridge helped promote business and growth in our society, created jobs, okay, and raised the standard of living in a particular area. That would be a good example of passing the tests of generally equity and efficiency, and also address our needs. Government involvement in our economy takes many forms. I'm going to give you arguably what are the 6 most recognizable forms of involvement. I'm going to start with the one that Adam Smith had in mind when he talked about limited government, and which I referred to a little bit earlier. They're called public goods. They're goods and services provided by the government and that are available to everyone. Education, national defense, the transportation systems that I mentioned a moment ago. There are 4 characteristics for public goods, for something to be classified as a public good. First, they're paid for through taxes. In other words, we collectively shoulder the burden as a society for the provisioning of these public goods. A second characteristic is that they are shared goods and services by the entire society. Everybody can use the roads. We don't have any restrictions on that. I know you're thinking of toll roads, but I'll get to that in a second. I'm talking about the public freeways. Another example, if you need another one for a public good, would be dams. Would be another great example of a public good. The third characteristic is that any number of consumers can use the public good, usually without reducing the benefits to any single consumer. We will look at here shortly the rare cases where a benefit of to some consumers are imposed by overusage. We'll get to that, but the general rule of thumb is that any number of consumers can use the public goods without reducing the benefits. The fourth characteristic is that increasing the number of people that actually use, or consumers that use the public good, will usually lower the cost of society of providing them. Take a road as a simple example. Let's say, to just pick a number, it costs us $1 million to build a road, and the road is going to be there for 100 plus years. And if you take the number of people over the lifetime of the road is in existence, even if you add in the maintenance cost, and you divide the number of people that use the road over its lifetime into the cost of providing the road, you'll see that on a declining scale, the cost to our society continually winds up being reduced or lowered. The next type or form of government involvement is a form that Adam Smith would have had a lot of trouble with and in agreeing to. And that's called regulation, the control of business practices through laws, legislation, and enforcement. I have 2 visuals here. The Occupational Safety and Health Act, which I mentioned earlier in the chapter, was a law that forced regulations on industrial workplaces to ensure worker safety. The Federal Communications Commission, to the right imagery here, regulates our communications markets and systems in the United States. To get a perspective, a modern-day perspective on why regulation as a point of government involvement is highly controversial, I would like to direct the students to the supplemental video section on the class website, where there is a really good supplemental video on the topic of would net neutrality kill the internet, and the Federal Communications Commission is at the heart of the debates over whether the internet should be regulated. And that'll give you a good feel for why regulation is a controversial subject for government intervention. Another common form of government involvement in our economic system is through welfare programs. And welfare programs are also known as safety nets. And here's what they are. Welfare programs are forms of government assistance that have the objective of reducing in our society the number of people living below the poverty threshold. Adam Smith would have had a problem with this type of government involvement in the economic system. And quite frankly, our government had not provided any welfare programs in the first 100 so years of our country's existence. It's only been since the middle of the 1900s, generally, that the government has engaged in providing and being involved through welfare programs. And it's become a point of controversy because the number of welfare programs since the middle of the 1900s has steadily risen dramatically in the United States. Let me now talk about why welfare programs are a point of controversy in our society. The reason welfare programs are so controversial is that they effectively redistribute income in our society. And what I mean by redistribute income is through the tax system, income is taken from one individual and given to another through the government for the purpose of, as I mentioned earlier, possibly to make sure the individual does not slip below the poverty threshold. And when you start to have an effect on people's income, and especially transferring it from one individual in a society to another, that's always going to cause passionate debates from two perspectives. Number one being, are all the parties being treated fairly or reasonably? That's that test of equity which I spoke about a little bit earlier. And whether for the money that is being redistributed, whether the program is meeting its goals in an efficient manner. There's another supplemental video on the class website in the supplemental video category that takes a look at income redistribution and provides you a little bit more depth and some example to illustrate the point, and I highly recommend that students make themselves available to check that video out. Here are a couple of examples of welfare programs, and a few of these you may be familiar with or at least heard of before. Social Security is a welfare program. Unemployment insurance is as well, as is workers' compensation and disability. Housing assistance and food stamps also fall into the category as being welfare programs. Now, with regard to these four welfare programs, many times you'll hear people refer to these as government transfer payments that result in no growth for the society. Let me take this in two parts. The concept of it being a government transfer payment is referring to what we're doing is we're taking income from one person and giving it to another so they don't fall victim to, the poverty threshold as an example. And we're just transferring money from one place to another. And part of the argument again, with regard to efficiency is that we're transferring money, we're not investing it into things that will help the society expand economically and grow and raise the standard of living. As an example, the money is not being invested in the building of new roads or bridges or transportation systems in general, I like to use as one example. And that's at the root of why these welfare programs are so controversial. But let me give you the other side of it. There are welfare programs that do meet the general test of clearly equity and efficiency. And here's one that's a great example. The early education, the Head Start program, the funding from the federal government for preschool for people that can't afford to send their child to a private preschool environment. This is an investment in the nation's future in education and building human capital. And that's a very important investment to make in society, because if we improve and keep up the level of human capital, we will be able to compete better, to innovate better, and raise the standard of living. So there's a strong argument on the side of equity and efficiency with a welfare program like early education or the Head Start program. My fourth example for you of government involvement in our economic system is also a controversial one. It's earmarks. It's legislation that is passed by the federal government that provides money for a favored project or industry. If you've taken your government class, you may have come across this topic under what they call pork barrel legislation. The most famous in recent years example to clearly illustrate earmarks and why they're so controversial was the Bridge to Nowhere that was funded through legislation supported by the representatives from Alaska to build a bridge up in Alaska. And all the contractors were paid to build this bridge, and the bridge was never built. So it's controversial to say the least. The government has gotten itself in very tough situations with a number of similar types of cases. And the number of earmarks, particularly over the past 20 to 30 years, has been on a steady increase. And many people say that this is one of the many reasons why we're running the deficits and building the debt from the national perspective, and has become a concern. So what are problems with earmarks? Well, first of all, it creates inefficiency. The Bridge to Nowhere example is certainly illustrative of inefficiency and the fact that the bridge was never built, so therefore we couldn't get any growth benefits from it. Waste resources, certainly the Bridge to Nowhere wasted taxpayer dollars, and inhibits competition and growth, because many times the money that goes for these pet projects goes to favored supporters of political parties and particular individuals, and it cuts out other people from competing for businesses, many times that could wind up doing project work more efficiently, effectively, and possibly at lower costs. Well, if you're outraged by the absurd government involvement in things like earmarks and the example of the Bridge to Nowhere, you can check out some other examples of earmarks that might irritate you even further through the class website in the supplemental video category. There's a Reason TV video on earmarks called The Alien Menace, and I highly recommend that students check that out as well. Yet, as absurd as earmarks might seem, there are some other government involvement forms that are actually more absurd than the earmarks. And they will complete our look at the 6 forms of involvement. And the first one is price ceilings. Price ceilings violate the rules of equity, the tests of equity and efficiency greatly, as do price floors. And we'll look at the details for these in Chapter 7 in depth so that you can see how these work and why, if they ever come up as suggestions for the federal government to engage in these types of activities that you'll want to speak up and give them plenty of examples as to why it wouldn't be a good idea. Well, since the government is involved in our economic system, in our study, we like to refer to our system as having two parts. And here's the first part. It's called the private sector. It's the portion of the economy that involves transactions of individuals and businesses. And the reason we divide our system into two parts is really for measurement purposes, which we'll get into more as we go through the year. So the private sector here is the sector that looks at the transactions of individuals and businesses. The other part of our free market system is called the public sector, the portion of the economy that involves the transactions of the government. Now, just like with the circular flow, can be a little bit of overlap or integration between these two sectors of our system. For example, when the government orders jets from one of our airplane manufacturers, the airplane manufacturer is obviously part of the private sector, but they're getting orders and they have a portion of their business that comes from the public sector. But generally, overall, these are pretty easy to measure in two separate categories, and that's how we measure the economic system. As we move into the second half of this chapter, we're going to look at a very interesting topic. The use of a capitalist economic system will naturally produce side effects to the society. And any government intervention in a capitalist system will be guaranteed to produce side effects. Now, the side effects can be either positive side effects or negative side effects. In this portion of the chapter, we'll look at how they're caused, why they're caused, and what can potentially be done to ensure that the side effects which will occur wind up being on more often positive side effects rather than negative. The side effects that our economic system produces are called externalities. I'm going to read you the formal definition of an externality, and then I'm going to focus in on a couple of very important parts of it. So here's your formal definition. An externality is a side effect from the production of a good or service or an economic intervention that generates benefits that are positive or costs that are negative to someone other than the producer of the good or service or the direct consumer of the good or service. Now, the point I want to make is I want to take this definition and break it into three very important parts. The first part is understand that externalities are side effects from production of goods and services, or an intervention, such as the government interventions that we've been looking at in this chapter. The second thing and important part about this definition is that the side effect generates either something good, a benefit, something positive, or a cost, something negative. And you'll quite often hear costs referred to in other ways relating to this. They are called unintended consequences and sometimes called market failures. So just be aware of that. And the benefits or the costs wind up being to someone other than the business or the individual producing the good or service, or the business or individual that is winding up consuming the good or service. A few moments ago, when I started this section of the chapter, I did mention that any government involvement in the economy will always guaranteed to result in creating some externality or side effect. Our challenge is to make sure that the involvement that the government takes satisfies the tests of equity as well as efficiency, and if at all possible, create a positive side effect rather than a negative. So let's look at some examples. I'm actually going to provide you with two examples of externalities and use two examples of negative externalities. So let me start with the first one. First one is actually a classic case. Let's say we have a company that produces plastics that are used in a wide variety of products that are sold to the public. And this company that makes plastics is located itself on a river, and in the production of its plastics that it sells to other businesses who make other products that include the plastic parts that this company makes, in the production of the plastics, the company dumps its wastewater, which includes chemicals, into the river that it is located next to, as it shows here in this picture. The chemicals in the water and the wastewater obviously pollutes the waterway. And with the water going downstream to the mouth of the river, it winds up having a negative effect on people who are trying to make a living from the seaside, such as the fishing industry, but also has a negative effect, the polluted water that is, on recreation industries. Now, stop and think about this for a second based upon the definition of an externality. The negative effect is not being put on the producer, the chemical company, and it is not being put on the consumer of the producer's goods, meaning the other companies that use the plastics to integrate them into their products. So here we have a classic situation of a external effect on somebody other than the producer and the consumer of the good or service that's creating the externality. For my second example of a negative externality, I'm going to use a situation that all of you are already familiar with or have seen before. I would like for you to think back to the first chapter video, the one that's titled Resources and Scarcity. The third story in that video involved the textile industry. And the story was about the workers in the textile industry. As a result of working there, many of them contracted brown lung disease. Now, this was an example of a negative externality. Stop and think about this for a second. The companies produced textiles that were used in clothing, rugs, various other types of things. The negative side effect did not fall on the producers of the textiles, nor did it fall on the consumers of the textiles, meaning clothing companies or the rug manufacturers, or the people that even bought the rugs or the clothing from those manufacturers. We had a negative side effect from the production of the textiles that surfaced in the form of the brown lung disease by the workers. Okay, so I've given you two pretty simple and pretty clear examples of negative externalities, negative side effects from the production of some goods and services. So how can we go about solving the problems caused by these negative externalities? And there are only two options to choose from in approaching trying to solve problems created by negative externalities. Here's the first option that's available to a society. It's to have the government handle trying to eliminate or change the negative externality, generally through some form of regulation. Now, stop here for a second and remember something. I said that it's a guarantee that if government gets involved in any way, that a externality is going to be created as a result of the government involvement. So although we have negative externalities in these two situations, If the government goes and gets involved in trying to solve the externality, its intervention will create some other externality. Now, it may be positive or it may be negative, and hopefully it will be positive, but it will guarantee cause an externality, a second externality. The other option is to let the private market, meaning all the people involved, handle solving the negative externality through some form of negotiation. Since I started with the option of the government stepping in to try to solve negative externalities, let me start with that first and giving you a little bit of some insight as to how they may go about trying to do that. The governments handle externalities, as I mentioned a moment ago, through regulation, and sometimes laws coupled with the regulation as well. And when they put these laws in place and this regulation, it's designed to force the elimination of the side effects. And let me give you 4 examples of how the government has done that in the past. For example, in the workplace, that we also saw in the video, and it's related to the brown lung disease situation, workplace externalities were addressed or started to be addressed through the Occupational Safety and Health Act. Environmental externalities were started to be addressed with regulation and laws under the Environmental Protection Act. And for product safety situations where there was an externality created, the Product Safety Acts. And then in the financial industry, Disclosure and Reporting Acts as well. Now notice something here is that with each one of these pieces of legislation, there was also created a government agency to oversee the enforcement of the laws and to also put in place some other regulations and guidelines to make sure that the externalities didn't wind up showing up again. Each one of these organizations that you see at the bottom of the screen is an actual government agency. There's the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, responsible to administer to the Occupational Safety and Health Act. There's the Environmental Protection Agency, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, and in the financial industry to enforce Disclosure and Reporting Acts, the government set up the Securities and Exchange Commission. Let's take a moment now and examine the other option that's available to a society to solve the problem of a negative externality. That other option is to let the private market, or the free market in general, try to solve the problem of the negative side effect through negotiation. And what occurs when this approach is taken is the use of what is called in the study of economics the Coase theorem. This concept of negotiation was brought up or conceptualized by Ron Coase, who is a Nobel Prize-winning economist. And what he said is that in these cases, when society chooses this approach to solve the problem, all the parties, the private parties that are in some way engaged in either the creation or being affected by the negative side effect, will get together and generally strive to reach a bargain or an agreement in which everyone is better off and the outcome is efficient. In other words, and you may have heard this phrase before, all the parties involved will try to find what is called a win-win solution to the problem. While the negotiation approach by private parties to solve negative externalities is usually far more successful than not, it is not successful when potential problems arise when there's something that's called a BATNA that is recognized or felt by one party. And what a BATNA is is a better alternative to a negotiated agreement, meaning that the opportunity cost of reaching some sort of negotiated settlement or agreement are too great. Now, a BATNA needs to be legitimate. Notice I have here a legitimate BATNA, meaning that there really has to be some substantial opportunity costs that are being given up that prohibits the parties from reaching a compromise, if you will, or a negotiated agreement. If you're not familiar with the word legitimate, it's an adjective. It means in accordance with law or established standards. That's a formal definition. The related words here, I think, apply most appropriately to what we're talking about, valid and accepted. Used in another sentence, his claim to ownership of the property was legitimate. One final word on BATNAs and also the Coase theorem. One of the best books written on it. It's a great short read, very easy to understand. It covers the Coase theorem and also BATNAs. Is Getting to Yes. It's written by the gentleman over here on the right side of the screen. It's pictured William Ury. Getting to Yes, Negotiating Agreement Without Giving In. Great book. Highly recommend that students pick this up. Very easy, short read. It'll make you far better in terms of your negotiating abilities, both in your professional and your personal lives. So I highly recommend you picking up that book at some point and giving it the read. Let's now go back to one of our examples and see how these options could be applied to solve a negative externality. And I've chosen to go back to the textile example with the creation of the brown lung disease. And the reason I've done that is because it's a very unique situation in that both options for trying to solve the negative externality of the brown lung disease were tried in this situation. So let's go through the process and you can clearly see how each one of the options was tried and what are the results. At the beginning of this situation, the companies and the labor unions, the private parties involved with regard to the negative externality, got together and started private negotiations and trying to solve the problem. And as you may recall, the suggestion was for the workers to wear dust masks, and the statistics showed that that would wind up eliminating somewhere in the 90 to 90, I think it was 95% of the instances of brown lung. However, the workers through the labor union felt that they had a BATNA, a legitimate BATNA, to sue the textile manufacturers under the Occupational Safety and Health Act in an effort to completely eliminate the disease. Now, in this classic case, the unions and the workers did not really have a legitimate BATNA and really didn't understand their opportunity costs, because in doing so, meaning suing under the Occupational Safety and Health Act to completely eliminate the disease, they eliminated the disease, but they also eliminated the industry's presence in the United States as it went offshore, and therefore everybody lost their jobs, or near everybody lost their jobs. So the opportunity cost of trying to completely eliminate the disease was, under the Occupational Safety and Health Act, the government intervention, reached that goal, but the opportunity costs were great as people didn't have jobs. Now, remember, we have government intervention here through the Occupational Safety and Health Act, and if you recall my suggestion to you so far in this chapter, in this section, that when there's government intervention, there's going to be some sort of side effect for this. And a side effect to somebody not involved in the case. So I'm not talking about the workers losing their jobs here as the industry disappeared. Let me take it a step further. With the industry going away, it made things worse where the companies, the textile companies, had been located. And it made it worse by creating additional negative results as other associate or businesses in the area that supported the workers and supported the factories, businesses like restaurants and hardware companies and so forth, were harmed because the companies got up and left and people lost their jobs. And when people lose their jobs, they don't get paid. And if they don't get paid, they don't go out to eat at restaurants and they don't spend money in hardware stores. Now, the hardware store and the restaurant had nothing to do with the production of textiles and had nothing to do with the brown lung disease. But the government's involvement in suing to helping the workers and the unions suing to eliminate the disease completely, that intervention had a negative effect on these other businesses. Now, before I move on to my next example of how government intervention, even when well-intended, can create externalities, I want to recommend to students that they go and visit the course website and take a look at the supplemental video that's available on the Coe's theorem and negative externalities. It'll help to firm up your understanding of the theorem and how the solutions can be to negative externalities can be achieved through private negotiations. Highly recommend that students do that. Okay, now let's move on to our next example. And that example involves public goods. Public goods are things that are broadly supported under a capitalist philosophy and a capitalist economic system as a good involvement of the government to help us in situations where the market doesn't have a solution or a support mechanism for our society. But remember, public goods as a government intervention is still an intervention, and holding true to my promise to you that government interventions will cause some sort of externality. It holds true for public goods as well. Let's look at an example. Well, the example of when a public good causes an externality is commonly called in the study of economics the tragedy of the commons. It's when a common public resource gets used more than is desirable. As you know from earlier in this chapter, a road or transportation system is a public good, and highways as part of the transport system often fall victim to the tragedy of the commons. The question to start our analysis of this is, what's our purpose behind the public good, for example, the highway system? It's obviously to promote commerce and growth within the society, help businesses grow, people conduct transactions, movement of goods and services. By the way, if you're not familiar with the word commerce, it means the buying and selling of goods on a large scale. A good synonym is trade, traffic in goods and services, business contact. Rational government economic policies will encourage commerce. In the term tragedy of the commons, the tragedy is the negative externality that results from the overuse. If you're struggling a little bit with the word commons, commons is referring to the broad public, all the people, the common man, if you will. So here we have a tragedy of something bad occurring as a result of trying to do something good, affecting the masses in general or the general public. So the negative externality in the case of the roads that results from overuse is the cost of traffic congestion. And the traffic congestion, ironically, limits commerce, which is what the roads and the highway system were intended to promote. And by limiting commerce, therefore, it limits growth in a society, the ability to prosper and for businesses to grow and employ more people. And in many cases, as the road or highway system gets overused, it has destroyed communities. Now you may say, well, how does it do that? Well, stop and think about this for a second. Businesses locate near roadways for easy access and the shipping of goods and services, and also making it convenient for employees to be able to get to their workplace. And if you have an overused resource where you can't get your goods and services shipped out on a timely manner, or your employees can't get to work in a reasonable amount of time, if it takes them an hour and a half or 2 hours to get to their job location and therefore also take the same amount of time getting home, what businesses and people wind up doing as a result of the congestion is picking up and relocating to other areas where they don't have this kind of a challenge, or this have to deal with this negative side effect from the traffic congestion. And as a result, it has destroyed communities. So in considering public goods and the potential for creating negative externalities, we'll take the road situation as an example. How do we go about solving this? And solving, for example, the road situation where it's been overused and we start to get too much traffic and congestion. What are the options in this type of a case to solve the externality? Well, in the case of the roads, we could obviously build more roads, but now what you're going to see is a number of things come into play here. The consideration of opportunity costs, also when trying to make rational decisions here with regard to solving these problems, we also want to make sure that the considerations of equity and efficiency come into play as well. So our decision-making process here is getting not so much burdensome, but maybe even a little bit more complex. So the first option is that we could build more roads. Well, that would certainly mean that the cost of building roads is high, but it would mean that taxes would probably have to go up to carry the cost of building the roads. If taxes go up through the building of more roads, that may not be fair to the people who were taxed who do not use the public good. So some questions wind up getting raised over the thought of equity in this type of an approach to solving the road problem. Now here's another potential solution, which has become a popular one. If you travel around the United States, you see that the use of toll roads are on the rapid increase throughout the country. And there's a reason why they are very popular. What you're going to find here as we examine what the benefits are to putting in toll roads is that we have a combination of really an effective use of opportunity cost considerations, but also the Coase theorem in this. So let's examine the option of putting in tolls to try to alleviate the congestion on a road or a highway. First of all, the cost of putting in tolls is far less than building new roads. Now that's going to have a tax implication here. It eliminates that fairness problem that I spoke about a moment ago, by having people actually pay for their usage. Now somebody would say, hey, wait a second, that's still a tax. And yes, it is. But here's a very interesting thing about that tax, okay, the toll. It makes the citizen actually use the Coase theorem on themselves by internalizing, forcing you to negotiate with yourself the solution to the externality. You may be sitting there saying, gee whiz, I don't want to sit in traffic on the highway. So is the opportunity cost of paying the extra fee to take a toll road that's been set up on, with tolls, a benefit to me? So we have the private negotiation going on within an individual that's studying the opportunity costs. But here I talk about the toll road being a very popular solution. The actual most popular solution is a combination of putting in toll roads and combining it also with carpool lanes. Now the same thing is at play here in terms of the decision-making process for the citizens in the surrounding area. Putting in carpool lanes, similar to the toll solution, it's a very low-cost solution. You're not building new roads. And again, it's efficient and also equitable because it doesn't necessarily raise taxes. As it's equitable and efficient because it forces the citizen to internalize the solution, meaning decide, in this case, not so much, or maybe it's in conjunction with paying the toll, but deciding whether it's worth it to them to have somebody share their ride with them to shorten the commute time to work and get to where they need to be. So the solutions of the toll road and or regulation through carpool lanes, or the combination of the two together, provide us a much better solution from an equity and an efficiency standpoint. But remember something about the toll road and the regulation through the carpool lanes. Those, again, are another form of government intervention to solve the tragedy of the commons externality in this case, back from a public good, which is, again, another government intervention. So now we have a second level of government intervention. And remember, true to the word, that is going to cause some sort of externality. But in this case, we have a different result than what we've seen in some of our other examples. Sometimes, and in this case it does, this intervention creates a positive externality in the form of what we call a free rider. Now, stop here for a second. Free riders are a general term that's used to describe the results of a positive externality. Now, the fact that I'm talking about roads and rides, there was no pun intended in using the term rider here, but it certainly fits the bill and describes the situation appropriately. So what in the study of economics, what is a free rider? It's somebody that, or some person or entity, and when we say entity, I could be talking about a business. So some person or entity that benefits from an externality. And in using this case of roads, I'll suggest to you a van, taxi, or bus service. Stop and think about it for a second. A bus or a van that can fit, some number of paying customers, and the van can travel on a toll road that has carpool lanes and bypass the tolls. And if they get the right mix together in terms of what they charge and how many people they can carry, many profitable van, taxi, and bus businesses have cropped up where you see toll roads and carpool lanes being established in communities. And as a result of the government intervention of the toll road and the carpool lanes, you have the creation of this free rider, or a company that benefits from that government intervention. So we have a positive externality here. We have now looked at a number of different types of government intervention and the externalities that are caused as a result of that intervention. However, we haven't looked at the majority of the types of government intervention. And one very big challenge for our society is to be able to rationally manage the side effects caused by all these other interventions. So what interventions am I talking about? Well, things like Social Security, health care, Medicare in particular, unemployment, earmarks, disaster relief, corporate and homeowner bailouts, okay, and environment and different types of safety protection. These are all government interventions into our economic system, and they all will have guaranteed externalities as a result of the interventions. Hopefully they're positive, that won't always be the case, so our challenge is to be able to rationally manage these side effects and try to hold each one of these types of interventions up to the tests of equity and efficiency. Another big challenge that we have is also determining how and to what extent and at what cost, or if at all, should government be involved in anything outside of public goods, as an example. And in this challenge, I want you to remember the warnings from Chapter 3 about how much government involvement in the economy and what the overall results of that wind up being. We've seen plenty of examples of that through history. And also remember the words of President Ronald Reagan, who relates back to, in this quote I'm going to show you, what can happen when the government does get extensively involved. Reagan said that costs are critical. Few, if any, governments have ever voluntarily reduced themselves in size once they have established something new. So government programs, once created, very rarely disappear. And actually, a government department or program, according to Reagan, as he said, is probably the nearest thing to eternal life that we'll ever see on Earth. So the bottom line is, as I mentioned a moment ago, what's very important is figuring this out. Despite what our values are, you must always apply the tests of equity and efficiency. Is it being fair? Is it treating people equally? And is it meaning being fair to people? And is it cost effective? Is it being efficient? As we wrap up Chapter 4 now, we're going to step back for a moment and look broadly at how the government should generally encourage economic growth in our society. There are generally 4 ways that the government should encourage growth and stability in our society. The first is by counteracting, through education and the right policies, the anti-capitalist attitude that rises periodically within our society. In going back to reinforce some advice from Milton Friedman from Chapter 3, here we have a quote from Carl Schramm, which takes it further by saying, "A utopia without business freedom will have no wealth to redistribute." A second way that the government should encourage growth and stability is to make sure, and I want to reemphasize this one more time, that measure all actions based on the test of equity and efficiency, and also promote economic citizenship through civic participation, getting the citizenry educated and involved in the decisions with regard to our economic system. And the fourth way to encourage growth and stability is for the government to continue to make strategic investments to encourage innovation. And remember, it's competition and innovation that help raise the standard of living and grow the society. Some examples of strategic investments the right investments in the right public goods in the right way, and also some other investments, as you may recall back earlier in this chapter, talk about important scientific work. Well, NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, would be a great example of that. There have been many products and services for the public and commercial businesses that have come out of the research that was done by the NASA agency of the government, but also the important point about investments to build human capital. And examples of that would be the land grant college grants that were made by the federal government quite a few years ago. Continue to invest in education so that we can continue to develop the human capital within our society. And that brings us to the end of Chapter 4. I want to recommend to students again that there are a number of videos, on supplemental videos on the class website that relate to Chapter 4. In summary, there's one that's a little bit comical but really strikes home and illustrates the point on legal plunder. There's a video on economics in one lesson, a summary of Hazlitt's book, and a number of others as well that you should make yourself available to, because it will help to reinforce the concepts that we covered in this chapter. And with the end of Chapter 4, it brings us to the end of our 4 foundational chapters. And with Chapter 5, we now move into what I call the mechanics of our study of economics. It's like building an engine. We're going to look at the component parts of the engine and how they relate to the others and how they work together to create a complete economic system. So I look forward to seeing you in Chapter 5, which is all about markets and demand. See you there.